shout out to Tyler, who asked what I thought was a pretty interesting question on Instagram. Instagram isn't really suited to having nuanced debates about, philosophy and shit like that because of all of the character limits and whatnot. So I said that I would go ahead and address it here. So Tyler asks, you're a chaos magician. Do you welcome the inevitable collapse or do you try to stall it? So thank you so much. The short answer is that I don't really necessarily accept any of the premises upon which this question is asked. There's the explicit one that we need to choose between stalling or welcoming and, quote, inevitable collapse. I'm kind of curious about what, I'm guessing of society or whatever, or the implicit one that's offered that chaos magicians would have some higher stakes or privileged perspective about this dichotomy that's been drawn in this question. I also don't really fully accept that anything is actually inevitable except maybe death and taxes. But that's also a matter of the scale at which we choose to look at things. I mean, the heat death of the universe is a thing or whatever. I don't know. So I'm not going to get into that part of it because we would be here all day. But I do feel like there seems to be somewhat of a misunderstanding about chaos magic, at least the way that I understand it, built into the thinking of this question. So I think it might be interesting to kind of unpack this here. There's a couple different things going on, but I'm going to address the magic stuff before getting into the more political or philosophical stuff. The way that I define chaos magic and think about it as a magical system or paradigm, and I would offer that it is its own magical paradigm, or you could consider it to be one. That's a matter of semantics, of course, though. But basically, this all has to do with understanding magic as being a sort of principle or property in the world in which we live. Of course, there's a lot of different ways this can play out, giving rise to these different ideas of the models of magic and all of the rest of it. But basically, magic is part of the complex system of our reality. The models that exist for describing and working with complex systems, like the ones we find everywhere in our reality, things like the stock market or ecosystems or water dripping, these can be described with complex nonlinear dynamics, chaos theory. The book Chaos, Making a New Science by James Gleick is actually a really good and accessible pop science book that goes into some of this stuff. You can check out The Fractal Geometry of Nature by Benoit Mandelbrot if you're a fucking power nerd like me and you're into that shit or whatever. But there are some interesting things about the way that all of these systems have stuff in common, and we can kind of draw these understandings about the what's going on behind the scenes of reality, if you will. I'm getting lost in the weeds here, but anyway, to me, chaos magic from the standpoint of magical theory isn't about creating chaos or necessarily about capitalizing on chaos. It's about understanding the subtle workings of the world and using that information to your magical advantage, whatever that looks like many systems of magic are. Chaos magic has the advantage of being able to reconcile modern ways of sense-making about the world using things like scientific and psychological models to explain our experiences along with older ways of thinking about the world, like stuff about supernatural forces or spirits or gods or whatever. So being able to reconcile these two things I think is really cool and powerful, another thing I like about it. You can use any system of magic to create chaos when it comes to the reality we live in. When we look at history, it's more oftentimes the fundamental versions of various organized religions of the world that are creating the most chaos. So I kind of reject the assumption that chaos magicians would have any special stakes or privileged perspective about forestalling or welcoming what you've called, Tyler, an inevitable collapse simply because the word chaos is in the name of the magical system. To the other premise about choosing to embrace or forestall this collapse, I also reject this dichotomy, as I said. When we look at complex systems, again, like the ones we find in the reality in which we live in, it's usually not really the case that we find a system completely in collapse or completely thriving or whatever. Things actually hover around a dynamic equilibrium. This is demonstrated by a strange attractor in chaos theory or whatever, if you want to get into it. But it's not typically the case that everything is fucked or everything is great. There's always going to be a sort of mix and dynamism and a push and a pull. So I think that some things are going to fail and be replaced by other things, as we would see in any ecosystem or other types of systems, economic systems and whatnot. Personally, I embrace the changes that lead to more freedom and equality, and I resist those that seek to disenfranchise and exploit people. And if a big collapse happened, like a big societal collapse, To me, by my reckoning, only the most privileged members of our society would be doing anywhere close to all right. And I'm sure that they would be just fucking fine with it if they were chill and the rest of us were totally fucked. Throughout history, it's often been the case that revolution has led to an increased amount of power being held by the state. The idea of welcoming or helping to create some type of collapse would likely mean welcoming or helping to create a more authoritarian style of government, and this, I believe, is what is at the secret heart of many who are welcoming a so-called inevitable collapse. Though I'm certainly not putting this on you personally, Tyler. That would be fucking wild. This is big picture stuff. I'm going to go ahead and read from one of my favorite sources. I say a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but also not, because so many people are constantly checking on it and fact-checking it and whatnot. Wikipedia. We're going to get into the term accelerationism, because I think that this is the territory we are playing in here. All right, so let's take a look. The term accelerationism originated with the sci-fi author Robert Zelazny in his third novel, 1967's Lord of Light. Accelerationism is a range of revolutionary and reactionary ideas in left-wing and right-wing ideologies that call for the drastic intensification of capitalist growth, technological change, infrastructure sabotage, and other processes of social change to destabilize existing systems and create radical social transformations, otherwise referred to as acceleration. It has been regarded as an ideological spectrum divided into mutually contradictory left-wing and right-wing variants, both of which support the indefinite intensification of capitalism and its structures, as well as in the conditions of a technological singularity, a hypothetical point in time at which technological growth becomes uncontrollable and irreversible. There's a couple different definitions of that singularity. This is Luxa again, but we can get into that another time. Back to Wikipedia. Various ideas, including stuff in Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari's ideas about deterritorialization, Jean Billard's proposals for fatal strategies, and aspects of the theoretical systems and processes developed by English philosopher and Dark Enlightenment commentator Nick Land, are crucial influences on accelerationism, which aims to analyze and subsequently promote the social, economic, cultural, and libidinal forces that constitute the processes of acceleration. While originally used by the far left, the term has, in a manner strongly distinguished from the original accelerationist theories, been used by right-wing extremists such as neo-fascists, neo-Nazis, white nationalists, white supremacists, etc., to increasingly refer to an acceleration of racial conflict through assassinations, murders, and terrorist attacks as a means to violently achieve a white ethno-state. Thank you, Wikipedia. I think many of the people who are advocating for collapse might not realize the wild perspective of privilege they might be doing it from when we consider how fucked a lot of people would be without things like medical care and pharmaceutical drugs and shit like that. When we unpack it, we can easily come to a sort of survival of the fittest type of situation, which fits in very well with some of these fascist ideologies that Wikipedia talks about at the end of the article there. So it's not really surprising that we see accelerationism joining hands with the far right. It's sort of funny to me about this notion of social survival of the fittest. This is a huge side note. It's just interesting how that sort of flies in the face of the actual reality in which we live. Survival of the fittest in terms of like how it actually takes place in the real world in nature requires diversity and mutation and crossbreeding and things getting fucking weird in order to happen. Monoculture, a lack of genetic diversity and things like that, can lead to sudden failures of entire crops or the collapse of entire animal populations. So in a nutshell, as far as I can tell, ideologies which are incongruent with the reality in which we live, or which privilege other imagined realities, whether that's the eternal life in heaven or abandoning the planet we're on and for one that we haven't fucked up yet, are in many ways sort of existential threat to us as a species. Thanks so much to Tyler for this awesome question. I know I got pretty far into the weeds there just based on that very short question you asked, but you obviously triggered something within me. So thank you. I really do love getting into this stuff. So thank you for the opportunity. Later on during Final Thoughts, I'd like to circle back to the idea of these libidinal forces that Wikipedia mentions as being one of the means by which these accelerationist agendas are sort of like pushed. And I want to examine what that might mean for us in our magical practice. Before we get into final thoughts here, I do want to mention that I am not speaking from the standpoint of a mental health care provider or anything like that. What I'm about to share with you all are my own observations and experiences and hypotheses about things. This is pretty much always the case on the show, right? I say in the beginning I only speak for myself, but it bears repeating sometimes, especially when you get into certain complicated things like this. Okay, the term libidinal forces came up in that Wikipedia article about accelerationism earlier. Let's take a look at what that word means, these libidinal tides. It has to do with libido, which hits my ear as being sort of like a late 90s term. I say sort of dating myself, I guess. In common vernacular, though, it typically refers to somebody's sex drive, their horny level or whatever. But let's look a little bit closer at a dictionary definition, which lets us know that the word libido comes from the Latin for lust or desire. So Sigmund Freud took the word and applied it to his own theories and ideas about things. So Freud first defined the libido to mean the instinctual energy associated with the sex drive, basically the procreation instinct to make more people. He later broadened the word's meaning and began to use it to mean things about the mental energy behind purposeful human activity of any kind, like a sort of like life energy. In other words, the libido, for which Freud also used the term eros, a Greek word referring to sexual love, came to be regarded for Freud as a sort of life instinct, which included sex along with other impulses we rely on to keep us alive. He called the opposite instinct, the one that creates self-destructive impulses and is associated with anger and sadism and aggression, thanatos. The idea that libidinal forces, those connected with what Freud called eros and thanatos, can be used as a lever by which humans can manipulate or influence one another is not really a new or very controversial idea. It's kind of central to modern marketing, where the aim is to identify the, quote, pain point of your target and then offer a solution. Here's an example. Your husband would probably pay attention to you again if you use this shampoo. It's a sort of, wouldn't you like to eat this nice carrot kind of thing. The way that many religious groups maintain power is kind of adjacent, but there's more of like an overt stick in this carrot-stick dichotomy, if you will. Here's an example. You're going to go to hell or be horribly punished unless you do what we say. So for religion, telling people what to do in the bedroom and sometimes what to do in other areas of life often seems to be a big part of this kind of like structure of social control or organization, or however you want to think about it. For advertisers, this is also present, but I think it takes more subtle forms. People who have experimented with using the energies associated with sexual activity or arousal or whatever for magical purposes might have noticed that this stuff can be pretty powerful. Also things having to do with like deep emotions like rage or anger or joy or happiness or anything like that. From a psychological perspective, stuff which involves us continuing on surviving either as an individual or as a species is baked in pretty deep in terms of our brain structure. Definitely speaking out of turn here, and I'm not an expert on this. This is just kind of the common thinking on this stuff. But things like fear and lust and anger, the longing for safety and love and understanding, these things are deep and powerful currents. And through influence techniques, they can be used to control people, especially people who aren't yet able to kind of own or take note of or take inventory of their own fear and lust and anger and the rest of it. So sex negativity is an example, like this idea of shaming people for natural biological stuff as being a very effective and common strategy for controlling people. Another example is causing people to be afraid and angry, or taking advantage of their desire to belong or build a better world. These things can all be levers and things that we do see if we look out into the world as being ways that people are sometimes manipulated by other people. So to operate from a locus of our own control, like to operate from a standpoint where we're the ones making the choices about our lives or other things, whether this is magically or otherwise, it's helpful to be able to be the one with your own hands on these levers, these things about fear and anger and love and lust and the rest of it. In order to do this, at least for me, it's been necessary to kind of sit with and understand and maybe even become friends with my own fear and lust and anger and longing for safety and love and understanding and all of the rest of it, or to discover the ways that these things can become teachers. These things can be like super uncomfortable, right, to like look at or sit with or whatever, and there can be a lot of stigma attached with doing so in some cases, and it's something that you do want to take a lot of care and precaution with, because, you know, whenever we're fucking around with something powerful, it also has the potential to be dangerous. So this is actually something we talked about in our consent and magic courses with Consent Academy. But anyway, these things can be incredibly useful too. So, and if you're not using them for yourself, I assure you that somebody else probably is in some way. So for me, I've gained a lot of ground in this area of, you know, having my hands on these levers for myself or whatever, of maintaining sovereignty of self by conducting some pretty, ruthless self-examination, as well as some pretty intentionally approached efforts towards gaining more forgiveness and love for the parts of myself I'm less fond of. And it's allowed for a lot of positive change and growth to occur and to continue to occur. This is an ongoing process. Therapy and my kink and magical practices have all been places where I've been able to discover and find good circles of protection to dance with these demons in, if we want to call them demons. Some of these things partake in that death drive, that thanatos that Freud talks about, things like rage, the scream I've been holding in my entire life. Some partake in what Freud would call eros, maybe the soft, naive heart that would make excuses for my abusers or whatever. And I have in the past, when I was, I think, less wise, attempted to sort of cut the things away that I didn't like about myself, to sort of permanently, banish these demons or whatever. But through experimentation, I have learned that the path to wholeness and power does not include cutting away pieces of the landscape of self. I mean, at least not for me. Now, because I'm willing to dance with these demons, if we want to call them that, while still keeping them in their magical circles, these things that used to cause me kind of a lot of trouble increasingly now work for me. And I want to know how grateful I am that this type of work, just getting into these areas of deep reflection, has been available to me. It's something that anybody can probably do if they choose to, but I'm given to understand that the ability to actually make that choice is more accessible to some people than to others. So it takes a lot of different things, some of them being courage and a willingness to look at all the things you might have been hiding about yourself from yourself, and to take accountability for what you find, and to forgive yourself so you can do better, and to be ready for this process to take the rest of your life if that's the time it's going to take. So if this is work that you're attempting in some fashion to try to kind of take a step back and look at stuff in an effort to make improvements, please give yourself credit for the strength and bravery that it requires, and go easy and gentle and take your time and all of the rest of it, and please don't be harder on yourself than you would be on a friend. And if you have access to mental health care, finding a good therapist can be a fucking game changer. The mushroom and its current, which seems particularly well suited to support this type of work, have also been incredibly helpful. And I'd like to express the gratitude that I feel for all of the insights I've been able to gain along this dark path that we've walked together. Whatever you're doing out there to operate more from the locus of your own magical control, I want to remind you to resist and share the Green Mushroom Project's statement of resistance. Resist. Resist by maintaining sovereignty of the self. Resist by maintaining love of the self. Resist by maintaining fierce loyalty to love and pleasure. Resist with acts of radical kindness. Focus on the path to better times. Fuck yeah.